Welcome back, history nerds. Today we're talking about the ultimate hold my beer moment in human engineering. We're talking about a ship so big, so expensive, and so unsinkable that God himself allegedly looked at it and said, "Bet." We've all seen the movie. We know the "draw me like one of your French girls" bit. We know the door was definitely big enough for Jack. But forget the romance for a second. The actual story of the Titanic isn't a love story. It's a comedy of errors wrapped in a tragedy, served on a silver platter with a side of rich people being weird. Imagine the most expensive cruise you can think of. Now imagine the Wi-Fi is out, the captain is vibes only, and the safety inspector is a guy named Dave who just wants to go home. That is the energy of April 1912. We're going to look at the hubris, the lace doilies, and the sheer, breathtaking stupidity that led to a giant floating palace being taken out by a very cold rock. Buckle up, because we're going deep. Like 12,500 feet below the surface deep. To understand the Titanic, you have to understand that the year 1912 was basically the Gilded Age on steroids. It was a time of massive hats, even bigger egos, and a complete lack of a vibe check. Our story kicks off in 1907 at a posh dinner party in London. This wasn't just any dinner. This was a meeting of the big boat boys. On one side of the table, you have Lord Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, the biggest shipyard in the world. On the other side, you have J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. Now, Ismay had a problem. His rival, the Cunard Line, had just released two ships called the Lusitania and the Mauretania. These ships were fast. They were winning the Blue Riband, which is basically a trophy for ships that go zoom. Ismay looked at those fast ships and thought, I can't beat them on speed, but I can absolutely dunk on them with sheer, ridiculous vibes. Let them have the speed. Who wants to arrive in New York sweaty and windswept? No, my passengers are going to arrive looking like they just stepped out of a velvet-lined jewelry box. We aren't building a ship. We're building a floating palace that just happens to move. So they decide to build 3 ships, the Olympic class. The plan was to make them so massive they'd have their own gravity. The Titanic was the crown jewel. She was 882 feet long. For my modern friends, that's 3 football fields. She was 175 feet tall. If you stood her up on her end, she'd be taller than any building on the planet at the time. She wasn't just big, she was a technological flex. She had a Marconi wireless system that was the 1912 version of 5G, mostly used so rich people could send telegrams saying things like, "Tell Jenkins to have my favorite slippers ready by Tuesday." But the real tea is the interior design. The White Star Line didn't just want a hotel, they wanted the Ritz. We're talking about a grand staircase topped with a crystal chandelier and an ornate clock that basically shouted, "You're poor," at anyone who looked at it. We're talking about a Parisian-style cafe with real ivy growing on the walls. There was a squash court, a Turkish bath, and even a gym with a mechanical camel. Yes, a mechanical camel. It was a motorized saddle that bounced you up and down to simulate the health benefits of riding a camel. Because apparently, in 1912, nothing screamed peak fitness like vibrating on a fake animal while wearing a 3-piece wool suit. But while the first-class passengers were busy vibrating on camels, the construction in Belfast was a straight-up industrial nightmare. 15,000 Irishmen spent years hammering over 3 million rivets into this thing. And here's where the foreshadowing starts hitting you like a brick. Because they were building the Titanic and her sister Olympic at the same time, they ran out of the high-quality number 4 steel rivets. So for the bow and the stern, the parts of the ship that actually, hit things, they used number 3 iron rivets. They were slightly weaker. They were good enough. It's like buying a Ferrari but using duct tape to hold the bumper on because the screws were on back order. By the time the Titanic was finished, she was the largest man-made object on Earth. The press was losing their minds. One trade journal called her practically unsinkable. The public dropped the practically because unsinkable makes for a better headline. Ismay and his crew didn't stop them. They leaned into it. They were so confident that when the ship finally left the docks, they weren't just sailing to New York. They were taking a victory lap across the Atlantic. They thought they'd conquered the ocean, but the ocean was just waiting for the punchline. All right, we've built the giant metal ego trip. Now let's talk about why the safety first signs were basically used as coasters for champagne flutes. So the ship is beautiful. She's shiny, and she smells like new carpet and overconfidence. But we need to talk about the safety situation. Or, as the White Star Line executives called it, that thing we have to do so the government doesn't yell at us. You've probably heard the stat. The Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats. That's like saying the Hindenburg had a slight smoking problem. But the why is what's truly unhinged. Meet our main character for this segment, Alexander Carlisle. He was the managing director of the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Now, Carlisle wasn't a villain in a top hat. He actually had a brain. He designed these incredibly cool Welland davits, the crane arms that lower the boats. His design was a masterpiece of engineering because each arm could swing out and lower 4 boats instead of 1. He told the board, "Hey, look at this. We can fit 64 lifeboats on this bad boy. We could save everyone, their dogs, and probably have room for a couple of grand pianos." And the White Star Line board, led by our boy J. Bruce Ismay, responded with the 1912 equivalent of K. 64 boats? Alex, darling, have you seen the deck plans? We've got a promenade. We've got palm trees in the veranda cafe. If we put 64 boats out there, the first-class passengers will feel like they're on a rescue mission, not a vacation. It's cluttered. It's busy. Give us 16 wooden boats and 4 collapsible ones. It's more minimalist. And here's the kicker. They weren't even breaking the law. The British Board of Trade regulations were written in 1894. Back then, the biggest ships were 10,000 tons. The Titanic was 46,000 tons, but the law said any ship over 10,000 tons only needed 16 lifeboats. The government basically looked at a massive floating city and said, yeah, treat it like a ferry. It's like the FAA deciding that because a Boeing 747 is technically a plane, it only needs as many oxygen masks as a crop duster. But the hubris didn't stop at the boats. Let's talk about the watertight compartments. The Titanic was divided into 16 compartments with heavy steel doors. The press called it a mighty subdivisible hulk. The idea was that you could poke a hole in her, the doors would slide down like a futuristic garage door, and the water would be trapped. Except, the walls of those compartments, the bulkheads, only went a few feet above the waterline. Imagine an ice cube tray. You fill one square, and if you tilt it even a little bit, the water spills over the top into the next square. The designers knew this. They just figured, what are the odds we hit something that breaks 5 squares at once? That's statistically impossible. It was not, in fact, impossible. And then there's the final boss of bad decisions. The lifeboat drill. April 14th, the very day the ship would meet its icy fate, was supposed to feature a full-scale emergency drill. This was the one time the crew would practice lowering the boats, and the passengers would learn where to go so they didn't wander around like lost tourists in a mall. Captain Edward Smith looked at the schedule, looked at the beautiful Sunday morning weather, and said, nah, let's do a church service instead. He literally canceled the only safety rehearsal they had. He figured the crew was professional enough to wing it. Imagine winging it with a 50,000-ton ship and 2,200 panicked people in the dark in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's the ultimate what could go wrong moment in a movie right before everything goes wrong. Time to meet the guest list. If you think modern celebrity culture is wild, 1912 would like you to hold its champagne flute. It's April 10th, 1912. The Titanic is docked in Southampton, and the pier is crawling with enough wealth to buy a small continent. This wasn't just a boat ride. It was the Met Gala on water. If you weren't on this ship, did you even exist? Let's talk about our first-class influencers. First up, the heavyweight champion of capitalism, John Jacob Astor IV. This man was the richest person on the ship, possibly the world. He was worth roughly $87 million back then, which is billions in today's I own a space program money. But John was in the middle of a massive PR scandal. He'd just divorced his wife and married an 18-year-old named Madeleine. The 1912 tabloids were losing it. They were basically the it couple everyone loved to hate, traveling with a literal entourage, including a nurse, a maid, a valet, and their Airedale terrier, Kitty. Because when you're that rich, even your dog needs a first-class ticket. Then, we have the legendary Margaret Molly Brown. Now, the movies make her look like a fish out of water. But Molly was a straight-up boss. She was new money from Denver. Her husband struck it rich in a gold mine. The old money ladies on the ship, led by the snooty Countess of Rothes, looked at Molly like she was something they'd stepped in. Oh, is my presence bothering you, Countess? Is my laughter too unrefined for your tea? That's cool. While you're worrying about which fork to use for your shrimp, I'll be over here speaking 3 languages and advocating for women's rights. Also, I'm unsinkable. Keep up. But let's look at the main character energy of the whole ship. First class had access to a Turkish bath that looked like a sultan's palace and a dining saloon that could seat 500 people. They were eating things like consommé Olga and filet mignons Lily. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds like it costs more than my car. But here's the reality check. While the Astors were debating the merits of caviar, 700 people were crammed into third-class steerage. These weren't vacationers. These were families from Ireland, Scandinavia, and Lebanon who had sold everything, their homes, their cows, their dignity, for a one-way ticket to a better life in America. The contrast was staggering. First class had one-to-one service. Third class had 2 bathtubs. For 700 people, 2 tubs. You do the math. By day 4, that new ship smell was definitely fighting a losing battle against 700 people who haven't showered. And yet, despite the class divide, everyone felt the same thing: safety. They were on the biggest, strongest thing humans had ever built. They felt untouchable. There's a famous story of a passenger asking a deckhand, "Is this ship really unsinkable?" And the deckhand allegedly replied, "God himself couldn't sink this ship." If history has taught us anything, it's that the universe absolutely loves a challenge. And the universe was currently prepping a giant frozen challenge right in the middle of the shipping lane. It is 11:40 p.m. on April 14th. The air is so cold it feels like breathing needles, and the sea is so calm it looks like a giant piece of black glass. This is the moment where the flex meets the reality. Welcome to the graveyard shift. Our main character for this nightmare is Frederick Fleet. He's perched in the crow's nest, squinting into a darkness so thick you could carve it with a butter knife. Now, remember how I mentioned the missing key? Fleet and his partner, Reginald Lee, are literally the only 2 people responsible for spotting danger, and they are doing it with the naked eye. No tech, no infrared, just 2 guys in wool coats vibrating from the cold. Sure is dark, sure is cold. Would be great if I had those binoculars, but no. David's got them in his pocket back in England, probably using them to watch a football match while I'm out here playing Spot the Invisible Giant Ice Cube. Because the water was so eerie and still, there were no waves breaking at the base of any icebergs. No white foam, just black ice against a black horizon. It's the ultimate stealth mission, and the iceberg is winning. Suddenly Fleet sees it. A dark mass. It's not white like in the cartoons. It's a ghost. He rings the bell 3 times, clang, 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 and picks up the phone to the bridge. "Is there anyone there?" he yells. "Yes," replies 6th Officer Moody. "What do you see?" "Iceberg, right ahead." Now we switch to the bridge. 1st Officer William Murdoch is in charge. He has about 37 seconds to move 46,000 tons of steel. This is the 1912 version of trying to drift a skyscraper. Murdoch panics, and honestly, who wouldn't? He shouts, "Hard a starboard," and orders the engine room to full astern, reverse. Okay, armchair captains, listen up. This was the fatal mistake. By putting the engines in reverse, the ship lost its propeller wash, the flow of water that makes the rudder actually work. He essentially tried to steer a car while slamming on the brakes on a patch of black ice. The Titanic didn't turn. She just slid. If they had hit the iceberg head-on, the bow would have crumpled like an accordion. It would have been a mess. People would have broken their noses, but the ship would have stayed afloat. But because they tried to swerve, the iceberg grazed the side. It wasn't a boom. Passengers said it sounded like someone tearing a long strip of silk. A gentle sht sound. But under the waterline, that gentle sound was the iceberg, acting like a 300,000-ton jagged thumb, punching holes through those good-enough iron rivets we talked about in Chapter 1. The iceberg unzipped the first 5 compartments. Remember our ice cube tray analogy? The ship could survive 4 compartments flooding, but 5? That meant the front of the ship would get so heavy it would pull the nose down, allowing water to spill over the top of the watertight walls into the 6th, then the 7th. Down in the boiler rooms, men were suddenly waist-deep in freezing Atlantic slush. On the upper decks, people were literally picking up chunks of ice that had fallen onto the promenade and playing soccer with them. Hey look, free ice for the Scotch. This ship is so fancy it even provides its own party favors. They had no idea. The Unsinkable ship had just been served a death warrant by a rock that had been floating around since the Bronze Age, and the clock was ticking. The soccer match with the iceberg chunks is about to get a very depressing reality check. This is where the invincible fantasy starts to dissolve into the freezing Atlantic. It's midnight. While most of the passengers are still in their pajamas wondering why the engines stopped humming, a very grim meeting is happening on the bridge. Enter our main character for this existential crisis, Thomas Andrews. Andrews was the ship's builder. He knew every bolt, every rivet, and every design flaw of this giant. He wasn't a corporate suit like Ismay. He was the dad of the ship. He carried a set of blueprints around like a security blanket. Captain Smith brings him down to the belly of the beast to see the damage. And Andrews takes one look at the flooding in the mailroom and the squash court and turns the color of a fresh sheet of paper. Okay, Tom, think. 5 compartments. The water is already at the E-deck. The bulkheads don't go high enough. It's the ice cube tray. It's the freaking ice cube tray. We didn't build a ship. We built a very expensive, very slow-motion submarine. Captain Smith looks at him and asks the million-dollar question, how long? Andrews doesn't sugarcoat it. He says an hour, maybe 2. Imagine being the guy who built the Unsinkable ship and having to tell the captain, yeah, so about that marketing campaign. We're going to need a lot of towels. Also, we're all going to die. At this point, the vibe shift is legendary. On the upper decks, the band, led by Wallace Hartley, starts playing ragtime. They aren't playing Nearer My God to Thee yet. They're playing upbeat tunes to keep people from losing their minds. It's the 1912 version of a This Is Fine meme, but with violins. Meanwhile, the crew is told to start uncovering the lifeboats, but they don't want to cause a panic. So they go around knocking on doors, politely asking people to put on their life belts and head to the deck. Excuse me, sir? Terribly sorry to bother your sleep, but the ship is technically a colander now. If you could just pop on this bulky cork vest and stand in the sub-zero wind for a bit, that would be grand. No, don't bring the caviar, just your dignity. People are literally refusing to leave. Why would you trade a warm, brightly lit, 46,000-ton palace for a tiny wooden rowboat in the middle of a pitch-black ocean? It felt safer to stay on the sinking ship than to get into the safety craft. This is the boiling frog theory of maritime disasters. The ship was sinking so slowly and so level at first that nobody believed Andrews. But then the mailbags started floating. The squash court, which was 32 feet above the keel, was completely underwater. The unsinkable myth was dying, and the crew was about to realize they had 2,200 people and only 1,178 seats. The math was finally starting to hit home, and it was cold, hard, and unforgiving. This is the part of the story that makes everyone want to scream into a pillow. If the Titanic is a horror movie, this is the scene where the car won't start and the neighbor is vacuuming their rug with headphones on while the monster is in your driveway. Alright, let's talk about the ultimate left on red in human history. While the Titanic was slowly turning into a giant, freezing slushy, there was another ship, the SS Californian, sitting just 10 to 12 miles away. They were so close that the people on the Titanic could see their lights. They weren't just in the neighborhood. They were practically parked in the driveway. Enter our main character for this absolute disaster of a nap, Captain Stanley Lord. Earlier that night, Captain Lord had stopped his ship because there was too much ice. He was being safe. His wireless operator, Cyril Evans, sent a message to the Titanic at 11 p.m. Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice. And how did the Titanic respond? Jack Phillips, the Titanic's overworked radio op, snapped back, shut up, I am busy. I am working Cape Race. I have 300 telegrams from rich people asking about their stock portfolios and hotel reservations. I don't have time for some guy on a tiny freighter telling me it's cold outside. We're on the Titanic, Cyril. We're basically a god. Leave me alone. So Cyril Evans did what any tired employee would do. He said, fine, suit yourself, took off his headphones, and went to bed at 11:30 p.m. 10 minutes later, the Titanic hit the iceberg. The Titanic started firing distress rockets. Now, in the International Code of Oh Crap, rockets mean, help us, we are dying. The officers on the deck of the Californian saw these white rockets. They woke up Captain Lord. They said, sir, that big ship over there is firing white rockets. That's weird, right? And Captain Lord, who I can only assume was having a very intense dream about crumpets, asked, are they company signals? Are they just having a party? Ah, yes, Captain. Nothing says party like firing emergency explosives into the air at 1 a.m. in the middle of a literal ice field. It's probably just a very aggressive fireworks display to celebrate the caviar being particularly salty tonight. Go back to sleep. He literally told them to keep an eye on it and went back to sleep. They watched the Titanic fire 8 rockets. They watched her lights disappear as she tilted into the water. They thought she was just sailing away. Meanwhile, on the Titanic, they were frantically Morse coding with a high-powered lamp. Come at once, we are sinking. The Californian saw the light blinking and thought, gee, they sure are chatty tonight, and didn't respond. If the Californian had turned on its engines and moved toward the lights, they could have been there in less than an hour. They could have saved everyone. Instead, 1,500 people were about to find out exactly how long a human can last in 28-degree water while a rescue ship sat 10 miles away with its radio turned off. It's not just a tragedy, it's a masterclass in not my job syndrome. This is where the British stiff upper lip meets absolute primal panic, and the results are, well, they're statistically devastating. We're on the boat deck now, and the ship is currently doing a very convincing impression of a sinking stone. It's 1:30 a.m. The water is now creeping up the grand staircase, ruining the expensive upholstery and making the mechanical camel in the gym officially a mechanical seahorse. Now we meet our main character for the rules department, Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Lightoller was the quintessential sea dog, brave, professional, and slightly terrifying. When Captain Smith gave the order, women and children first, Lightoller interpreted that as women and children only. On the port side, where Lightoller was in charge, if a lifeboat had 65 seats and only 20 women were standing there, he'd lower the boat with 45 empty seats. He literally prevented men, even husbands and fathers, from getting in, even when there was zero line. I don't care if there's enough room for a football team in that boat. The captain said women and children. If I let a man in, it's a slippery slope. Next thing you know, we're letting dogs in, then cats, then, heaven forbid, an American. Meanwhile, on the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch was being a bit more chill. He interpreted the rule as women and children first. But if the boat is still empty, sure, hop in, Dave. Because of this, choose your own adventure style of evacuation. The first boat to leave, lifeboat number 7, had a capacity of 65. It left with 28 people. Lifeboat number 1, capacity 40. It left with 12 people. 7 of them were crew members. 12 people. On a ship with 2,200 souls. That's not a rescue, that's a private cruise. I hope the legroom was worth the crushing guilt of leaving 1,500 people behind to turn into human popsicles. And let's talk about the third-class passengers. This is the part the movies actually got right. They were essentially forgotten. There were no announcements in their languages. The stewards were literally trying to keep them below decks so they wouldn't clog up the first-class promenade. By the time the gates were opened, most of the lifeboats were already gone. It wasn't just a disaster, it was a demographic culling. If you were a man in third class, your survival rate was about 8%. Those are winning the lottery but in reverse odds. As the last boat, Collapsible D, is lowered at 2:05 a.m., the ship is now standing almost vertically. The lights, powered by engineers who stayed at their posts until the very end, God bless them, are flickering a ghostly red. Then the great silence. Not of the people, but of the ship. One of the funnels, remember the fake one from Chapter 1, snaps off and crushes a bunch of people in the water. The ship's spine literally snaps under the pressure. The Titanic just realized it wasn't a skyscraper. It was a 46,000-ton piece of iron that gravity was finished being polite to. The stern rises high into the air, silhouetted against the stars, and then she slides. No big splash, just a gurgle. And then the worst sound in the world. 1,500 people in the water, realizing the lifeboats aren't coming back for them. The ship is gone. The ocean is quiet again, looking like nothing happened, which is honestly the most disrespectful thing the Atlantic has ever done. Now, we enter the part of the story where the lawyers come out and everyone starts pointing fingers like a Spider-Man meme in top hats. It's April 18th, 1912. The RMS Carpathia, the hero ship that actually answered the help text, piles into New York Harbor with 705 survivors. The city is in a state of collective shock. People are literally wandering the docks holding signs with names of loved ones, hoping for a miracle that isn't coming. But while the families were grieving, the main characters of the corporate world were already warming up their legal defense. Enter our final main character, Senator William Alden Smith. Senator Smith was the guy chosen to lead the U.S. inquiry into the sinking. Now, Smith was a bit of a legend because he knew absolutely nothing about ships. He famously asked a witness if the watertight compartments were where the passengers hid to stay dry. Look, I don't know what a starboard is. I don't know why the boat is made of iron if iron sinks in my bathtub. But I do know that 1,500 people are at the bottom of the ocean, and I am going to make someone's life a living hell for it. The hearings were a circus. They dragged J. Bruce Ismay, who had managed to sneak onto a lifeboat while his passengers were still on the deck, into the hot seat. The press absolutely nuked him. They called him J. Brute Ismay and the coward of the Titanic. Ismay's defense was basically, I was just a passenger who happened to own the company. I didn't see anyone else waiting for that boat, so I figured, why not? It's a long swim to New York. Then they went after the SS Californian. Remember Captain Lord from Chapter 6? The guy who slept through the fireworks? The inquiry found that his ship was closer than any other and could have saved basically everyone. He was officially blamed, but because he didn't technically break any laws of 1912, he just spent the rest of his life as the most hated man in the maritime industry. But here's the moral of the story, the part where humanity actually learned something from this 46,000-ton ego trip. Because of the Titanic, the world sat down and wrote the Solace Treaty, Safety of Life at Sea. They finally made it a law that every ship must have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Groundbreaking stuff, right? They also mandated that radio rooms be staffed 24/7, so no more shutting up and going to bed while people are firing distress rockets. And the International Ice Patrol was formed. To this day, they track every single iceberg with an attitude in the shipping lanes so that no other luxury liner gets vibe checked by a frozen rock. In the end, the Titanic wasn't just a shipwreck. It was the moment the 20th century realized that technology doesn't make us gods. We built the biggest thing ever, called it Unsinkable, and the universe responded with a 10,000-year-old piece of ice and a missing key to a cabinet. The moral? Don't skimp on the lifeboats, don't ignore the iceberg texts, and for the love of everything holy, if you're the chairman of the company, maybe stay on the ship until the job is done. Thanks for hanging out in the deep end with me. Now, go call your mom and tell her you're glad you aren't on a ship in 1912. Stay salty, history nerds.